Hi everyone, today we're going to make this fresh strawberry banana cream pie. It's my version of the Banberry pie that's sold at Polly's Pies in Southern California. We'll make an all butter pie crust and fill it with a banana cream filling using fresh pastry cream, and then we'll top that with some fresh strawberries and whipped cream. I'm Adriana, and if you enjoy in-depth baking tutorials, go ahead and join me by subscribing. Now let me show you how great this pie is. The first thing that you want to do is make the all butter pie crust. To the bowl of a food processor, go ahead and add your flour, then add your kosher salt, then a little bit of sugar, and your baking powder. Pulse these dry ingredients for about 10 times to mix completely. Meanwhile, go ahead and go grab your cold butter from the fridge that's been cubed, and what you're going to do is add about a quarter of the cubed butter at first, and you're going to fully incorporate that into the dry mixture. The reason that we do this step first before we start pulsing with the rest of the butter is because incorporating the fat with just the flour completely coats the flour so that it inhibits any kind of gluten from forming later on in this process. So once that butter is completely combined into the flour and you don't see any butter left, go ahead and add the rest of your butter, and this is where you're going to pay attention with how many times you actually pulse. The total number of times you'll need to pulse is going to depend on how many crusts you're making at once and the strength of your food processor. So I estimate around 8 to 12, depending on those variables. For this particular recipe, since we're only making one crust and I know my food processor, it takes me about 8 times to reach the stage where the butter is the size of large peas. Once I'm happy with the size, go ahead and pour the flour mixture into a mixing bowl. The reason that we do this step in a large mixing bowl is because it's much easier to assess the texture and the moisture level of the dough with your fingers than if you were to use the food processor. So go ahead and grab your ice cold water and apple cider vinegar. And what I like to do is mix a couple tablespoons into the apple cider vinegar to dilute it, and then add that to the dough first, because if you just add straight up apple cider vinegar to the dough, I find that you can get like little pockets of vinegar in your dough, and this way it kind of mitigates that. Use a spatula to gently toss the dough around, and the water will absorb into the dough. You likely won't have enough water at this point, but do this step first and kind of get a feel for the dough, and then start adding more ice water, about a half a tablespoon at a time, until it reaches the right moisture level. So you want the dough to come together and be actually a tiny bit sticky. That's totally normal for pie doughs to be a little stickier than, say, a tart dough, but I always roll out my pie dough on a floured surface. So I always err on the side of making my dough a little bit stickier and wet, because it's much easier to add flour to a dough than it is to add water later on. Once we're done adding water to the dough, we're now going to prepare to chill it. It's also called resting the dough because we've been kind of messing with it a little bit. So just lay out a piece of saran wrap and pour all of your dough out onto the surface. Then once my dough is in the saran wrap, I kind of like to do a pre-folding step before it goes in the fridge. So what I do is kind of mold it into a ball, then press it down with the heel of my palm, and then I'll open up the saran wrap and fold it into thirds, and then smush it down again into a ball, and then fold it into thirds the other way. So once I'm done with that step, I will fashion it into a large disc that's flattened. This just helps it chill faster and makes it easier to roll out into a circle shape when it's done chilling. Once your dough has chilled for at least an hour, but preferably overnight, go ahead and prepare your work surface by sprinkling on some flour. Now, just to preface, I used pastry flour to make this dough that you see right here. Pastry flour has a lower protein content and is ideal for making pie crusts, but the trade-off is that it's much more difficult to roll out. So if you're a beginner, I suggest starting out with all-purpose flour. You're still going to get really great results in a super flaky crust, but if you want to step up your pie crust game, I highly suggest finding some pastry flour. Okay, so dust your rolling pin, your hands, and then sprinkle a little bit on the surface of the pie crust as well, and just start rolling. So push away from you, go from front to back, and then flip the pie crust over and roll again. So notice how I'm flipping and turning at the same time. That's going to ensure that you kind of get a circular shape. You're going to do this flip and turn until it reaches about 50% in the diameter of the pie pan, and that's because after you reach about 50%, it gets a little bit too large large to do flipping and turning, and you might actually break the pie dough. So once you get to that point, just go ahead and just start rolling your pie dough out into a relatively circular shape, and then we'll lay it into the pie pan. One method to get the pie crust into the pan is to drape the crust over the rolling pin. I like to use a bench scraper to make sure that the pie crust doesn't stick, and so I just slide the bench scraper underneath the crust and then slowly start to drape it over the rolling pin. Then place your pie pan next to the dough and then pick up your rolling pin and allow your dough to fall into the pan. Then go around the inside of the pie pan and make sure it's completely flat against the pan. And because we're blind baking this pie dough, it's super important to go and prick holes along the bottom of the pan. This is also known as docking the crust. This allows the air to escape so that you don't get any bubbling along the bottom. Place this crust in the freezer for at least 30 minutes before baking. I always bake my pies on a baking sheet. It's really important when you have a bubbly fruit pie. It's just easier to handle when you're blind baking. The key thing with blind baking is that we want to simulate a filling as much as possible. So that's why we fill these pie crusts with beans or pie weights or rice. The pie weights ensure that the pie crust has structure. So you want to fill it completely to the top and make sure that you weigh the crust down so that it bakes really flat and upright. Parchment paper works best. You can use foil if you don't have parchment paper, but what I do is crumple it up into a ball, lay it inside of the unbaked pie crust, and then fill that with my pie weights, which I just have old beans and rice. Bake that in the lower third of an oven that's been preheated to 400 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 20 minutes. You want the pie to be about 90% baked. It'll just be really pale, but it should have structure at that point. Once your pie is done with that first part of blind baking, go ahead and remove the parchment paper with the rice and the beans. The crust at this point will likely be really pale like this, but that's totally fine because we're going to stick it back in and brown it completely. Place your crust in the oven for another 5 to 10 minutes or until it looks like this. Then when it's still piping hot, go ahead and brush the interior with some egg white. The proteins in the egg white creates a barrier and prevents any kind of moisture from the pastry cream from getting into the crust and ensures that your crust stays super crispy. We are now going to make the glaze that goes on top of the strawberries, which is also referred to as a nappage. The nappage is that really shiny glaze that you see on top of fruit tarts, and I'm going to make mine with fruit juice to help bring out the flavor of strawberries. Lots of fresh strawberry pies like to use strawberry Jello as the glaze on top, but I find that to be really sweet and artificial tasting, so we're going to make our own using fruit juice and pectin. So while your fruit juice is heating up, all you have to do is mix some sugar and some fruit pectin together, and when your juice is warm to the touch, it should feel like really warm bath water. Go ahead and pour in your sugar and pectin and whisk that together. Let that pectin mixture boil for a few minutes, and then you're going to add in some lemon juice. The acid in the lemon juice is going to activate the pectin and cause it to get thick, but it's actually not going to get that thick when you're stirring it. It's going to get thick after it cools down. So go ahead and just set that aside while you prepare the other ingredients. I like whipped cream for this pie, so I'm just going to make a really quick whipped cream by adding some cold heavy cream and a couple tablespoons of sugar. Whip that on high speed for a few minutes until it reaches stiff peaks. The next thing that we're going to do is prepare our strawberries. Fresh strawberry pie often has whole strawberries inside the pie, but I find this kind of difficult to slice and bite into, so I like to at least slice the strawberries in half or sometimes in quarters if they're really large. Then slice up 2 to 3 just ripened bananas into 1/4 inch slices. Alright, let's assemble the bottom portion or the banana cream part of this pie. I will add a link to the vanilla bean pastry cream in the description box below. You can also use boxed vanilla pudding if you don't have time to make the cream. Take your cold pastry cream and add it to a bowl and whisk it until it's nice and smooth. Grab your baked and cooled pie crust and start by adding a very thin layer of pastry cream along the bottom of the pie. Then add a layer of your freshly cut bananas on top of that pastry cream. Add some more pastry cream on top of the bananas, making sure to fill in all the gaps in between the bananas. Then add the second half of your bananas on top of the pastry cream. Make sure during this process that you taste test the bananas to make sure that they taste okay. This pie normally has 2 large bananas in it, but if you have a lot of taste testing, you might need 3. Last, top with the rest of your pastry cream. I like to pipe a decorative border with the whipped cream along the pie, but you can also just dollop some whipped cream on top of the finished strawberries if you like. Next, take your strawberries and start arranging them in the center of the pie on top of the banana cream filling. And the last step is to brush with your glaze. So just make sure that it's nice and thick at this point. It should feel like a really loose apricot jelly. And then all you have to do is take a pastry brush and just brush on top of the fruit. And here is the finished fresh strawberry banana cream pie. You'll want this to chill in the fridge for at least a couple hours before cutting. This pie turns something really simple like strawberries and bananas into something quite elegant. I really suggest if you have time to try out my vanilla bean pastry cream because it's worth making for this pie. This is a good one, guys, and the recipe's on my blog, Tasty Pastry Kitchen. Thanks for watching and have a great day.